think that's it for now, but please be aware of the events that are posted in your program. We have a few things coming up that you'll want to have on your calendar. And at this point, I want to invite up our co-pastor, Alison. So let's make Alison feel welcome that she comes.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everyone. As Mike said, my name is Alison, and I'm one of the pastors here at the River. So today, I'm very excited. I am going to kick off a new sermon series called Living with Intention. The inspiration for this series comes from a modern-day parable that you may have heard before. It goes like this. While two young fish were swimming along, they happened to meet an older fish swimming the other way. The older fish nodded to the younger fish and said, "Good morning, how's the water?" The two younger fish swam on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looked over at the other and asked, "What the heck is water?" The younger fish were surrounded by water. The water was their home and was essential for their survival. It was of the utmost importance to their lives. And yet, they didn't fully understand it. To a certain degree, it doesn't really matter that the younger fish didn't know what the substance around them was called. The name itself wasn't necessarily important. But I can imagine that there would have been some benefits to better understanding this powerful force that had such a profound impact upon the shape of their lives. I suspect that it would be helpful for a fish to know how the water moves and flows, to be able to identify which currents are helpful to follow and which ones they should avoid, and so on. And the same is true for us in the metaphorical waters we swim in. Have you ever heard that phrase, the waters we swim in? Social scientists use that phrase to talk about culture. Culture surrounds us. We live and breathe and move in it. And yet sometimes we are so close to it, so accustomed to its presence, that we no longer notice the ways it is moving and shaping us. At times, we are like the younger fish in the story. And this is when we can run into trouble. Cultures, like the humans who create them, are a mix of good and bad, healthy and dysfunctional. They are complex and multifaceted. There are aspects that are life-giving and others that are harmful. Wisdom comes when we're able to discern between the two, and when we're able to be intentional about moving toward the parts of culture that promote mutuality and flourishing, toward the life in all its fullness that God intends for us. So our hope for this series is that we'll be able to take a look at some of the cultural currents in the world today, and that we'll be able to tap into some of the ways that faith may help us to navigate them. Some of these currents you may be very aware of. Others may be new to you. Today, I want us to think together a bit about busyness and rest. So I don't know about you, but life feels very busy for me, sometimes too busy. According to a 2018 study in the journal Nature Human Behavior, 4 in 5 employed US residents say that they feel time poor, which means that they chronically feel like they have too many things to do and not enough time to do them. Have you ever felt that way, like there just aren't enough hours in the day? Yeah. In recent years, there has been more discussion around topics like work-life balance, self-care, and so on, which is great. But these discussions have not necessarily led to greater feelings of time affluence. In fact, they can sometimes feel like added pressure, another standard to live up to, or more items to add to the to-do list. One reason that we continue to struggle with time poverty is the reality that many of its drivers are systemic or structural. Things like lack of childcare support, the emergence of global markets and 24/7 economies, increased connectivity leading to increased FOMO, and wage stagnation in many fields all contribute to time poverty. Systemic issues like these cannot be solely addressed on the individual level. They require large-scale solutions. Realizing this can be both validating and discouraging. It's validating because it means that our inability to achieve this elusive work-life balance is not simply a personal failure. And it's discouraging because if it's not an individual problem, then it means that our personal efforts will only find limited success. We will still have to push for and wait for societal change. Individual changes are not enough. It's important to acknowledge that. But they can be a good place to start. Another aspect to consider is that in our culture, busyness is often treated as a status symbol. There are a number of studies indicating that collectively, we tend to view busy people as more capable and successful. Swimming in these cultural waters can impact our default settings. It can lead us to believe that if we are not busy all the time, if we take time to rest, we are doing something wrong or failing in some way. If we are honest with ourselves, we may realize that being busy helps us to feel productive, successful, or like we are taking advantage of all that life has to offer, living life to the fullest. Being busy might help us to feel needed, in demand, and important. Or it may allow us to avoid sitting with painful or uncomfortable feelings. So as we think about how we as individual fish or together as a small school of fish can find rest in a world that glorifies busyness, I think that the Bible can offer some helpful perspective. In particular, I'd like us to consider the very first story in the Bible. The Bible opens with two creation stories. The second one, the one with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, is the one that folks are more familiar with. But today, I want to talk a bit about the first account, which we find in Genesis 1:1 to 2:4. In the story, over the course of 7 days, God brought order out of chaos. In the beginning, the earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God created light, and God saw that the light was good. God separated light from darkness, creating the first day and night. On the second day, God created the sky. On the third day, God gathered the water so that there would be seas and earth, and God saw that it was good. God co-created vegetation with the help of the earth, and God saw that it was good. On the fourth day, God created the stars, the sun, and the moon, and God saw that it was good. On the fifth day, God co-created water creatures and winged birds with the help of the waters and the sky, and God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply." On the sixth day, God co-created earth creatures with the help of the earth, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humans in our image according to our likeness." So God created humans in God's image. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, God created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply." God saw everything that God had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Okay, and then this is where I think things get really interesting. The passage says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. On the seventh day, God finished the work that God had done, and God rested on the seventh day from all the work that God had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that God had done in creation. The passage tells us that a number of things happened on the seventh day. First, God finished the work that God had done. Second, God rested. Third, God blessed the day. And fourth, God hallowed it, meaning God made it holy or set apart. There's so much that is strange about this passage. Why did God rest? It seems unlikely that God was tired and needed to take a rest to regain energy. No, God was likely up to something else. And how is it possible that God both finished God's work and rested on the seventh day? Biblical interpreters have been debating this question for centuries. Some felt that these two statements could not be reconciled, so there must have been some kind of mistake. So they decided to change the word seventh in the passage to sixth. You'll see that in many English translations. But if you look at the original Hebrew, it clearly says, on the seventh day, God finished the work that God had done. What does it mean that God was both resting and finishing the work of creation at the same time? In his influential book called The Sabbath, Abraham Heschel, a Jewish rabbi, theologian, professor, and civil rights leader, said this. The words, "On the seventh day, God finished his work," seem to be a puzzle. Is it not said he rested on the seventh day? We would surely expect the Bible to tell us that on the sixth day, God finished his work. Obviously, the ancient rabbis concluded there was an act of creation on the seventh day. Just as heaven and earth were created in 6 days, Menuha was created on the Sabbath. We tend to think in binaries. An object is either in motion or at rest. A person is either doing something or doing nothing. But Heschel argued that God's rest was actually an act of creation. God was creating Menuha. The Hebrew word menuha is often translated into English as rest or resting place. But the concept of menuha is so much richer than what can be captured with those English words. Menuha, which we usually render with rest, means here much more than withdrawal from labor and exertion, more than freedom from toil, strain, or activity of any kind. Menuha is not a negative concept, but something real and intrinsically positive. To the biblical mind, menuha is the same as happiness and stillness, as peace and harmony. It is the state wherein man lies still, wherein the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest. It is the state in which there is no strife and no fighting, no fear and no distrust. The essence of good life is menuha. What a beautiful and expansive vision of rest. A vision where rest is not just the absence of labor, but the creation of peace, tranquility, harmony, joy, wonder, and delight. In Judaism, there's a beautiful practice called Shabbat, or Sabbath, that you may have heard of before. For one day each week, work is set aside in favor of rest and connection to God, self, and others. This practice is connected to the idea that in the first creation narrative, God set apart the seventh day as holy. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating that you start practicing the Sabbath. Because it was designed for communities to practice together, it can be really hard to do in isolation. And more importantly, as Christians, we should be cautious when it comes to appropriating aspects of Jewish tradition. But I do think we can learn a lot from the mindset around Sabbath. Sometimes we forget that Jesus and his first followers were Jewish, and that the Sabbath was a big part of their spiritual lives. We can sometimes forget this because of the passages in the New Testament where Jesus challenged religious leaders over ways that their Sabbath practice had prioritized rules over people. But those critiques did not mean that Jesus was against the Sabbath. And Jesus was not the only Jewish leader or teacher to make such critiques. Early followers of Jesus debated amongst themselves whether Sabbath should be a part of Christian practice. Some thought it was important, but others disagreed. This is why throughout history we've seen some strands of Christianity, like the Puritans or Seventh-day Adventists, practice Sabbath, while many other Christians do not. Personally, I can't help but wonder what we might have lost by letting this practice go. We know that resting is good for our physical health and mental health, but Heschel made the case that Sabbath rest is also good for the souls of those who practice it. He argued, the Sabbath is a day in which we abandon our plebeian pursuits and reclaim our authentic state, in which we may partake of a blessedness in which we are what we are, regardless of whether we are learned or not, of whether our career is a success or a failure. It is a day of independence of social conditions. All week, we may ponder and worry whether we are rich or poor, whether we succeed or fail in our occupations, whether we accomplish or fall short of reaching our goals. But who could feel distressed when gazing at spectral glimpses of eternity, except to feel startled at the vanity of being so distressed? Often we approach rest as something to be earned. I've worked hard, so now I can rest. Or something we can only do when we are really tired or sick. I'm exhausted or don't feel well, so now I can rest. Or as a way to prepare us for future labor. I need to rest so that I can work hard and achieve my goals. But Sabbath rest is different from this. Sabbath rest is not something to be earned. It is freely given by God. And it is not for the sake of future labor. It is to help those who practice it to remember that worth is separated from performance, to help them understand that they cannot always be in control, nor should they strive to be, to shape them into people who are intentional about carving out space for connection to self, others, and God, and who cultivate experiences of peace, wonder, joy, and delight. It may not make sense for us to start practicing the Sabbath, but what might it look like for us to adopt a Sabbath mindset? To engage in embodied practices that help us to learn similar lessons as Sabbath practitioners. How might this help us grow in connection to self, others, and God? One thing that stands out to me about the Jewish Sabbath is that the preparation for the day is very intentional. A lot of thought goes into preparing what the physical space will look like, what fresh flowers will be on the table, what foods will be eaten, what clothes will be worn, who will be present, and so on. What might it be like to approach our own times of rest with this kind of intentional preparation, rather than as an afterthought to be squeezed into our lives? Another thing that stands out to me is that the Jewish Sabbath is a weekly ritual. Rest is not just reserved for occasions like being sick, reaching burnout, or going on vacation. Rest is woven into the fabric of life. What might it be like for us to build rest into our lives more regularly? One of the most famous Psalms, Psalm 23, says this: "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake." As I was working on this sermon, I learned that the word "still" here comes from the word for rest we were looking at earlier, menuha. This makes sense to me. Whenever I have had the opportunity to spend time by still water, like at this lake on the screen behind me, I have found myself rested and restored. We tend to think of still as doing nothing, but that has not been my experience of still waters. The waters may not be moving physically, but they are definitely doing something profound within me. What might it be like to think about our own stillness in this way? As not the absence of something, but as the generation of something positive and beautiful in our own lives and in the world around us. So, throughout this sermon series, we want to create space for you to reflect and practice some of the things that we'll be talking about throughout the summer. So at the end of each sermon, we're going to carve out time for that. So for those in the room, you'll see that you have these like little cardboard things and some pens. We're going to hand out some reflection questions in just a minute, and we'll give you about 10 minutes to really just sit and reflect. And for those of you who are joining us via live stream, we'll have the questions projected up on the screen. But before we move into reflection, I want us to end with a communal prayer that comes from Richard Rohr and is based on Psalm 46. So we'll go through the prayer one line at a time. I'll read the line to you, and then I would like you all to repeat the line out loud back to me. All right? Okay, let's start. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. Amen. So now we'll put on some reflective music. We'll take about the next 10 minutes to reflect before we come back together for some more worship.
we're going to move into a time of communion.